Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. My guest, Steve Bassett, is one of the world's leading voices in the disclosure movement and has worked tirelessly advocating for full disclosure by governments regarding what they know about UAPs and ETs, but have been withholding from their citizens. In 1996, Steve established the Paradigm Research Group, a political advocacy organization that addresses the politics of UAP ET issues. And in 2023, he co-founded the Hollywood Disclosure Alliance, an organization I'm proud to be a member of. Steve Bassett, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Dan, it's good to be with you. You're very spiffily dressed. Very nice. I like your friend in the back there. Looks about right.
Do you recall, Steve, when you first became interested in the UAP ET movement? What was the catalyst that brought you into it? And what motivated you to become the strong advocate for disclosure that you have now become?
The short answer is I always noted the articles and things that turned up about this phenomena. I loved sci-fi, read lots of that as a kid. And I read enough to convince me, yeah, this is obviously true. It wasn't hard to arrive at that conclusion based upon what was being shown and stated. But of course, apparently it wasn't going to be accepted. And I didn't really pay attention to that. It's just that I went through the first half of my life, pretty much quite confident that there was this non-human presence. The question is, then what? But I wasn't involved. During the 60s, I got into activism, not as much as I wanted to, should have done a lot more. But I think I learned back then that that's kind of who I was. I was kind of an activist, meaning a person that doesn't like to work with others, or at least doesn't like to have a boss, likes to cause maybe a little trouble, doesn't like to fall in line, kind of a loner. Yeah, I had all that, but I didn't lean into it. Many years go by, and I reached a point in my life where I had to decide, what do you want to do? Because you really haven't built something to take anywhere. You've just been floating for 40 years. A lot of people do that, and most people don't have the good fortune that I had. In 95, I read some serious books, including John Mack's book. Went to my first conference down in Los Angeles, and I got a sense of this thing is happening. But John Mack was the key. John Mack is a Pulitzer Prize winning Harvard professor, highly distinguished, long career, that he actually was taking the risk to work with contactees to maybe try to do some research that could get published, peer reviewed. That said something is happening here. And then I thought about it. The more I thought about it, I realized how important it was. And then I said, okay, look, let's do that. But what? I wasn't a researcher. I didn't have a massive library of stuff. I wasn't a journalist, but I was an activist. But nevertheless, I said, okay, this is a good door to go through. I have no idea what's going to happen. So I called them up. I had their address and phone number in the back of the book. And I convinced them somehow, to this day, I don't know how, to come and volunteer. Come and volunteer. I have a business background. I've done this, that, whatever. Maybe I can be helpful. For whatever reason, I persuaded them. So I drove cross country, stopped at a couple places, ended up in Boston, Cambridge, got a roommate apartment, and spent 4 months as a volunteer at John Mack's Program for Extraordinary Experience Research, where I met my first contactees in person and just got filled with energy, just felt I was in it. But I still didn't know what I could do. I knew I wanted to. I knew how big it was. I said, this is a lifetime commitment. I felt that pretty confidently. But what? And I had lived in Washington off and on my whole life, knew it well. I was there during many of the demonstrations, marched on the Capitol a few times, good marches. And I said to myself, the politics is the problem. It's not science. It's been proven. There's proof everywhere. Why isn't it out in the open? Politics. The government has decided. There's nothing there for their own reasons, political, national security. And so that's the solution. You've got to solve the political issue. You can prove it until the cows come home, but they're not going to accept it. So I said, okay, politics is it. Now what? And then I'm sitting in my office and it hit me like a download. Boom. Nobody is stupid enough to have actually registered as a lobbyist on the extraterrestrial issue. There is no money, no upside, lots of ridicule. No way I could be the first because I got nothing keeping me back. I had created a life when there was just nothing to hold me back because, well, I hadn't done stuff to do that. And so I rushed down to Washington, got there on July the 4th. Within a week, I had created Paradigm Research Group as a sole proprietorship, filed the registration as a lobbyist, PRG. I called it Paradigm Research Group because I called up a number of research organizations and said, I'm registered as a lobbyist. I'd like to represent you. Free. no cost. And they go, free? No problem. So I had a list of research kind of organizations or similar that were submitted as part of the registration. That's why I called it Paradigm Research Group, even though it's not a research organization. And it was the best, smartest thing I ever did in my life. And so couple months went by, and I'm out doing something, whatever. I'm trying to get it all together. I'm online, emailing, whatever. But it took about 6 months, and then the Washington Post found out about my registration, and they said, that's interesting. We need to find out who that guy is. So they sent a reporter out. I gave him a long interview. They published a legitimate article and a big photo. Big photo. I've got it. I may start spreading that around. It's an awful photo too, but I look terrible. But in any event, on the front page of the business section, which is the #2 page in the Washington Post, I assure you, in the Washington Post was a big deal in 1997. And suddenly, I'm off. And from that point on, I was able to pursue activist efforts on this issue with a singular goal. But it took 3 years before I really started to get a handle on it. And so some of my most important contributions are right around 2000. Been in for about 2.5 years, 3.5 years. And that's when I decided that one of the problems was language, that bad language is not good for activism. It'll ruin it. You've got to get the right language or you cannot connect. And so first I addressed UFO cover-up. I said, that's not the right term. I don't like UFO anyway. UFO is a problem. I prefer UAP, which was sort of around, but it took a while for it to really get more prevalent. UFO is stigmatized, demonized, intellectually ghettoized. Anytime you uttered the phrase, people laugh. But that's no good. And cover up basically said the government's programs were illegal. All these national security guys breaking the law, criminalizing the people you're trying to reach is not effective activism. So I said, we need a new term. I came up with truth embargo. So I came up with that. That worked. And then I worked on the UFO thing, trying to maybe shift over to UAP. The other thing was I understood that we need some language to describe what we wanted, where we were going. Every activist movement has to have a prize. It has to have something that people understand. They're going to spend money, take risks, get involved, maybe for years in order to achieve. If you don't have that prize, why in the hell are they going to get involved? And the movement didn't have the prize. All it had, the movement back then, was prove, prove, prove. We're going to study this, study that, going to come up with reports, prove, prove, prove. To do what? I guess in order to get people to know that the ETs were really real. That wasn't going to fly. And so I said, what's the prize? What is going to allow this issue to become what it has to be? You have to have confirmations from the heads of state. 10,000 pilots could say, I saw a UFO. Doesn't matter. The president has to do it in order to move forward and end the truth embargo. So I came up with disclosure with a capital D. Greer was using the term as part of his organization, but I think most in the revealing definition. I said, no, got to make it a proper noun. Capital D disclosure. What is it? It is and only is formal confirmation by heads of state of an extraterrestrial presence engaging the human race. And that's the prize. Everything we do going on has got to get that statement. Proving it over and over and over and over and over again is not going to get us there. We've got to take a political road there and start engaging it as a political issue. And those are some of the early contributions I made. And I'm pleased that the word disclosure, I think with a capital D, is in the UAP Disclosure Act. The truth embargo is mentioned from time to time. And anyway, that's one part of activism, and that's all I've been doing for 30 years.
When it comes to disclosure, excitement is in the air and everyone feels it. After too long a time, it looks like all the planets are aligned and the truth about UAPs, ETs will finally be revealed by governments. So what I'll do now, Steve, is ask you about a few recent events as well as a major upcoming disclosure event. On January 15th of this year, 2025, 5 days before the inauguration of his father, Donald Trump Jr. interviewed Louis Elizondo and Ross Coulthart on his podcast Triggered. And of course, with Elizondo and Coulthart being guests, they discussed UAPs and disclosure. What, Steve, did they say, and what was Trump Jr.'s reaction?
I can't really go into the detail of what they said. This is a while ago, but they said the usual things. I mean, they definitely engaged it. There was good stuff being talked about. And that was no accident. That was intentional. That was deliberate. We just learned recently in the documentary, this very important documentary, Age of Disclosure, as well as a major interview that the writer-director Dan Farah had with Joe Rogan. In addition, to individuals approaching George W. Bush very early in his administration with a serious discussion about whether they should do this, because Bush, I think, kind of knew. I think his father definitely knew, passed it on to him, and so it was in play. And the decision was made not to do it. Or they were still thinking about it when 9/11 happened that same year, and that tabled it. And we also learned some people had been talking with Trump about this as well. This doesn't shock me. We know that Trump was actually, and this was in the first term of Donald Trump. We're in a different place than we've ever been. We know that the president is aware. The idea of disclosing has been discussed with him, and we're seeing all kinds of events that seem to indicate this is going somewhere. And that podcast by Don Jr. was one of them. And I recommend people go to Triggered, go find it and listen to it. And remember, it's 5 days before his father's to be inaugurated. Then 6 months later, 5 months later, the vice president goes on Ruthless podcast and talks about how he's obsessed with UFOs and other things. Shortly after that, Tulsi Gabbard, director of national intelligence, goes on another podcast. I think it was Pod Force One, and talks about the subject. And that's not an accident. That is intentional. And then about 10 days later, Anna Paulina Luna, chairman of some of the hearings in the House Oversight Committee, the newly elected or appointed director of the task force to declassify government secrets, who has spoken to this issue. She goes on Rogan for 2 hours, and this comes up substantially. That is not an accident. And then just about 10 days ago, about 6 days before the film came out, roughly, The Age of Disclosure, Vance comes back again. He goes on Pod Force One, same one that Luna went on, I think, and reiterates how he's so interested in the subject, and just happens to mention that his very, very good friend, Marco Rubio, is also interested in the subject. This is almost like it was the promo ahead of the Age of Disclosure. Not an accident. And so I can say without any reservation that the idea of Donald Trump, President Trump, stepping out and confirming the extraterrestrial presence, which is all he has to do, that's disclosure, doesn't have to say anything else, could take less than 5 minutes. Could happen tomorrow. Now, in addition to the film coming out, Age of Disclosure, major milestone film, it's going to have huge impact. Articles are being written all over the place. Within a few days, Dan Farah goes on Joe Rogan. That's the same Joe Rogan that took the interview with Trump that helped get him elected, the same one that Luna's on, and now you've got Farah on for 2 hours. And in that 2 hours, they're talking about the film and a lot of other things that Farah learned as he's making the film, so it's adding more. You got to put the two together. Watch Age of Disclosure, watch the 2 hour interview with Rogan, and if you still think there's nothing to this issue, man, you need to start taking some energy drinks or something, or ketone shots, I don't know what. They talked about Trump doing it again. They talked about Trump being able to do it. Both of them agreed it was a good thing. And Joe said, I'll talk to him about it. And when Joe Rogan says, I think I'll talk to the president, he can talk to the president. So all I'm saying is the truth embargo is literally collapsing in real time. It's like one of those demolitions you watch. You're waiting and waiting and waiting for 79 years, and all of a sudden the charges go off and boom. We're seeing it collapse in real time, barring something really awful happening that's a major distraction. The president is set up. Everything's been done. The legislation, members of Congress, the hearings, the tremendous amount of media witnesses coming forward, all of which is 1,000 times more than what had happened in the previous 7 years. The stage is set. Donald Trump can be the disclosure president, and as pointed out by me many times and by Farah, it's a Nobel Prize. It's an absolute incredible legacy, one of the most important things that any head of state has ever done. And I would suggest that this president, as opposed to the other 13 that have been in the White House since Roswell, he has the personality to do it, whereas the other ones had to be convinced and didn't. And so I'm simply saying, folks, don't be shocked. I'm hoping that the White House will put out one of those things, that there will be an announcement from the president in the Oval Office, maybe in Wednesday at such a time. And just everybody's getting all excited and speculating. And then Wednesday comes, he sits down in front of that Resolute desk, camera on, doesn't need anybody else in that room except the camera operator, and says, my fellow Americans, you have been hearing about this non-human tech, non-human bodies from many, many people. I've made inquiries. It's true. We aren't alone. There is other tech, other entities. We have bodies, and so forth. That's true. And so I'm going to leave you now. There will be press conferences tomorrow. Hearings are going to happen, and you're going to learn a lot more. But I'm tired, and I need to get some rest. And that's disclosure. And we're in the post-disclosure world. And that is what I and many others and everybody that's contributed to understanding this issue since 1947, going all the way back to Keogh, have been trying to get 80 years of citizen science, activist, journalist documentary. And now new people have stepped in with high levels of gravitas and so forth, and talents and skills like Dan Farah, and they're taking the ball home.
On September 9th, the third major UAP hearing was conducted before the Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets. It was titled Restoring Public Trust Through UAP Transparency and Whistleblower Protection. Were any conclusions, decisions made about transparency and whistleblower protection?
It wasn't about conclusions or decisions. It was about listening to five more witnesses. It was about getting more information on the record, under oath, from people that are in the know. And all of that is part of the process that does lead to legislation. So the UAP Disclosure Act, which was originally submitted 3 years ago, got cut in half, but that half is functioning. Stuff is actually coming out, believe it or not. Go to the National Archives and check out the UAP archive section. Nothing earth shaking, but it's happening. But the major part of the bill with the powers to enforce and other matters were taken out. It's been resubmitted 3 times, hasn't made it back, hasn't made it yet. It's going to be resubmitted again. We will get the UAP Disclosure Act. And that was built on witness testimony, but mostly private in the offices and to staff, also what was being found out in the hearings and so forth. But when it comes to legislation, you need a platform, you need a basis to proceed. Just don't pull it out of thin air. And so if you're trying to convince the Senate to vote for an NDAA that has a UAP Disclosure Act in it, it doesn't hurt if some relatively significant people of rank and station, have testified under oath to a committee. And so that is part of the process that allows you to get that legislation. Which leads me to the most important point your listeners can hear from me today. And that's this. And I've said it many, many times, and I'll keep saying it right up until disclosure. Everything that's going on, the hearings, witnesses coming forward, all the media coverage, the attempt to get a passed legislation, advancing the legislation, trying to get a comprehensive bill, finally. Members of Congress literally going on cameras and expressing their opinion. Yes, it's here, it's real, we have ETs. All of that is not getting the stuff to the public. Meaning, okay, we're gonna let you know what's going on now. We're gonna tell you this and tell you that. No, it's not. And so every time somebody testifies, and you go, wait a minute, you know more than that. Why did you say you could only talk in a skiff? Why are you doing a non-disclosure thing? Because that's not what is going on. What is going on is getting enough testimony, enough witnesses, enough media coverage, enough members of Congress involved to set the stage for the president to tell you that we're not alone, that we have visitors, we have tech, we have bodies. And then the things you want to know will start coming out. They will start coming out at a pretty nice pace. It'll take a while, but it's all going to come out. And that, of course, is what people want. But they're thinking that's happening now. No. And so rather than get mad at these people because they're observing their NDAs and classified statuses and so forth, what they're doing is getting the job done without violating the laws, without violating the commitments they've made responsibly, which it can be responsible. That you don't have to have whistleblowers running around with their hair on fire, screaming out stuff. No, just people able to speak to the level they can. And when they write something, it goes through Dobster, which is an organization that, a government organization that decides if something can stay in the book or come out of the book, and they take out what they have to, and they publish. This is an orderly, appropriate process. It needs to be responsible in order to keep those inside on board with the process. They start seeing illegal stuff happening and people violating the law to do that, they're going to tighten up. That is what is happening. And once you look at it that way, you're going to be less upset. You're going to be positive. You're going to see how this is going, where it's going. And where it's going is the president's going to confirm. And then we're going to start getting information out through the UAP Disclosure Act in a responsible way, under the law, with a review panel, which may end up being congressional and not presidential. No big deal. That's what's going on. It's actually a responsible effort to actually do what we've all wanted for 80 years. And it would be helpful if people would be a little less critical and more supportive. But I understand their frustration. I get it. My job is to try to make it a little easier as an activist, and that's what I'm doing.
The documentary film, The Age of Disclosure, which you've spoken about, received considerable media coverage and social media attention. Could you, Steve, give me a brief synopsis of the documentary and tell me about the reviews of that it received from the media as well as the public at large who saw it?
Over the last, say, 80 years, there have been hundreds of documentaries about this subject, and you can find them if you look. UFO TV has got God knows how many. They all have one thing in common. They were created by regular citizens or individuals with some skill, but not professionals, really, not professional filmmakers with all the degrees and the background and connections and agents and all that kind of stuff. No, no, no. It was a citizen journalistic or citizen documentary process, and that helped. It helped move us along. It's all part of the disclosure movement and a very important part. And all that is still available and they will be viewed. But never could they get a big screen, an actual former premiere with a big screen and so forth, because the industry people were not going to go here. They would not make these docs. Only recently did some serious industry people get into making actual nonfiction on this. Now, they've made unbelievable numbers of these sci-fi films with ETs in them. That many have made billions of dollars. The genre has made hundreds of billions of dollars for the industry, counting everything, product sales and all that kind of stuff. Very lucrative. But they haven't made docs because why? They don't want to upset the government. They know these big shots who are very wealthy. They know what's going on. They get tipped off. They don't need to get a briefing from the CIA. And so they realize you start putting up docs on that big screen and giving it that kind of gravitas, the government is not going to be happy about that. And that's not good because we're doing great. We're making fortunes here. Why do we want to make things miserable for ourselves? Not to mention the fact that they constantly use government resources, Air Force, Navy, you name it, as part of their movies. It's a good deal and it makes the movies better. So they just didn't do it. And that helped keep the truth embargo going. For the last 4 years, I was also out in LA a lot and trying to maybe see what could happen there. I was able to found the Hollywood Disclosure Alliance with Dan Harari, and that's help in that regard. But it finally is broken. What happened here is that a gentleman who is a professional content creator based in Los Angeles with the connections and the usual things, agents and managers and all that stuff, decided after getting involved for a while, helping to produce some films independently. He worked with James Fox. He was a producer. He decided he was going to make the doc that was going to break that barrier. It took him 3 years. And it's simple. Because he has the ability to do it, he attracted the attention of people that might want to help. And Lou Elizondo was critical. Elizondo ended up being the one that started lining up and bringing in the people that could be interviewed for this doc. And the more people they got, the easier it was to get further people, thus creating the most significant assemblage of individuals of rank and station to ever speak to this issue in the same venue. Ever. Nothing comes close to this. It took them some time to get it together. Then they did the filming pretty much in secret. Then they did the kind of things that big time filmmakers do. They took it to the South by Southwest about a year ago, film festival, #2 film festival in the country. It got seen by people, created a little buzz. Then maybe there was some discussions for the next months over platforming it or whatever the hell. And then finally he makes his decision what to do. So the film is getting, the film, even without it being shown, is getting a lot of media off the trailer. So I'm watching that, and not surprising. 80 years went into building up the interest in this subject so the trailer would get that. And so that helped. And then as they get closer, the real interest builds up, and then they announce the premiere. And what they announced was, again, groundbreaking. What he didn't go with the studio. He did it independently because he knew a studio could get involved here because this issue is what it is, biggest of all time. Did it on his own, but still highly professional, and got a deal with Angelica Pop-Up Theaters, really cool theater thing. I went to it. It's like going back in the old days. It's really nice. It's not the big super fancy stuff, but it's just really fun. It's comfortable. He got a premiere in 3 of them, New York, LA, and Washington. They've showed it all day on the premiere day, 21st, and they're showing it, I think, all the following week, all of which was necessary to qualify the film for an Oscar nomination. Another major breakthrough. Now, will it get one? Don't know. There's about 230, I think, docs that have gone through a process that makes them eligible, and then it has to be pruned down to 15. Many of those documentaries are damn good, but none of them address something as profound as this one. So depending upon what happens in the coming weeks, and things are already happening, not the least of which the president coming out and saying, yeah, it's all true, it might get nominated or at least get to the next level, but not because it's super cooler, better than another doc in terms of the total production, but rather because of how important it is. And docs do advance because of that. And it might make the top 15. If it gets into the final, it'll be nominated. And even if it doesn't win, I can't even imagine how I'm going to feel the night that I watch the Oscars and they get to the documentary category and then start announcing the nominees. And The Age of Disclosure is one of them. Knowing how many people worked so hard for that, many of which are gone, who I knew. I've got 100 of them on my in memoriam section on my website with the bio and a photo. And knowing that finally it happened. And then I'll start thinking about all of my colleagues that are still here and they're watching it too and what they went through to make that possible. Everybody today that is getting into this field, and we love them all, with all kinds of careers and credentials and accomplishments, are still standing on the shoulders of 80 years of citizen research, journalism, documentary, and activism with little money, a lot of ridicule, and a lot of sacrifice. And I'm going to keep reminding people of that because that's the way it works. That milestone is up ahead. And now the marketing of the film is well underway. He goes on Rogan, bada bing. But again, because he's Dan Farah, he got on Maher ahead of the film, got the special 10-minute front interview where they talked about it very well. And Maher made it clear that he's come around. He's been a little, not sure, but he's on board now. All the questions were great. Maher brought up the nuclear shutdown thing, which is the most important thing in all of it. That's going to go up on Netflix. And Maher's show, Real Time, is the highest total viewed program on Netflix. Then it went on CNN for 1 million viewers. And then it's now obviously going on Amazon. But then there was a overtime 10-minute online thing that they do after Bill Maher. A lot of people don't know about it. So they do about 10 minutes. Farah was involved in that, came up, and that goes on the YouTube channel for Real Time with Bill Maher. How many subscribers does that have? 2.3 million. And if you look at all the short clips, that's what they have, overtime and new rules. You look at these clips over time that they put up there, they have 24, 25, 27 million views. And all of that, the Netflix, the overtime, the YouTube, is going to still be there going forward as people watch that, drawing people to this film. How successful will it be? I don't know. It's already getting savaged by the debunkers and the skeptics, and we can talk about that have never gone away. And now they have an even bigger platform. But I think its ultimate viewership will be substantial. And then if we get disclosure, well, that's another matter. And so the fact that disclosure, used as I defined it 25 years ago, is in the name of that film, I'm really pleased about that.
A major online conference, the State of the World Forum, will be netcast December 14 to 17. 50 panelists will address 4 aspects of a world that can positively shape human civilization going forward. The UAP disclosure process underway is one of them. Can you, Steve, tell me who are some of the presenters, the topics they'll be covering, and any special events that are scheduled to take place?
The State of the World Forum, this is a reincarnation. There were 6 State of the World Forums in the 1990s, 95 to 2000, I believe. And the principal person behind it was Mikhail Gorbachev, who became a world figure, more so after, of course, the Communist Party was outlawed and he eventually stood down. But he was a visionary. He knew Jim Garrison. So they created the Gorbachev Foundation, and Jim was the president. Then they said, let's do a major conference. And Jim put together the State of the World Forum. Gorbachev participated. And why did they do it? And this is so important. I lived my whole life under the nuclear threat. I was born 15, 16 months after the Hiroshima bombs. No, I was conceived. Anyway, the point is, I lived my whole life under the nuclear threat, mutual assured destruction. It's not good. It's not good for the psyche. It's not good for your nervous system. We all have. We've had numerous proxy wars underneath the umbrella of those nukes that have killed millions. So the world's a mess. But after the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall, there was this huge explosion of optimism. People saw a way out, a way forward. So let's don't do this again. And that is the context in which the State of the World Forum was created. High-level people and heads of state came in to be there in person to talk about the state of the world at that time and where it could go. It was a very significant thing, but it was before the internet. And so the legacy of it is a little hard to find, though on the website, stateoftheworld.forum. And the legacy is, there's a lot of legacy there, and you can also search for it. That optimism, of course, was betrayed. In due course, the leaders of nations and so forth said, let's start the Cold War again. Let's start the old ways. And we saw things going backwards. I've done a lot of interviews. It's amazing I'm standing up or sitting down. The point is that they started it all again. to take us to where we are now, which is incredibly dangerous. The world is, in a sense, more at risk of nuclear war than it was certainly in 1990. And so, but guess what? A major change, even more profound than the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that is the ET disclosure. And anticipating that, Jim reached out to the people that knew about the original one to put together another State of the World Forum. 6 years, going to go to 2030. Because of the various circumstances right now, the first one had to be online. And what they're going to do is they're going to examine the state of the world from some perspectives that didn't exist back in the 1990s. One of the key sections, NIH, non-human intelligence. Another major key section, artificial intelligence. Another major section would be like the Earth intelligence, because the life sphere that we have, there's a lot more going on there than, and we're learning that all the time, than it was in the 1990s. We figure that out. And then psionics, the name for the reality of telepathy, and soon I think remote viewing finally emerging into the mainstream after being completely classified for decades and decades while they tried to weaponize it. That's going to be there. That's some pretty interesting stuff. And so 51 speakers or panelists are going to address these in plenary sessions over 3 days. And there'll be some other things. That is what is coming up. I'm a sponsor. And so consequently, if you are listening to me now and you go to my website, paradigmresearchgroup.org, my phone number and email are right there. Email or text me or phone me, preferably text, that you want to register, and I will provide you immediately a code that will save you a lot of money off of this event. So that is the upcoming. Now that is just, let's talk about just give me a couple of examples of what's in this thing to show you how things are moving forward. One of the people in there is the woman that is now leading the emergence of telepathy as a real thing in the open world, Diane Hennessy Powell, the creator of the telepathy tapes, which have been seen by millions. So she's going to be there. That's new and that's substantive. But then a woman by the name of Beatrice Villarreal is going to be there, because of something else that's breaking. Stuff is breaking everywhere. It's the collapse of the truth embargo. We're celebrating almost ahead of time. Beatrice Villarreal is a physicist who works for the Nordic Institute of Astrophysics, which, in case you're wondering, is a serious organization based in Sweden where they give out Nobel Prizes. And she did something that I call elegant science. There's super deep, complex science with math you can never master, that they get a breakthrough and you get Nobel Prizes for that. But sometimes you can get a Nobel Prize for elegance, meaning it's not incredibly complicated, but it so elegantly gets to something that no one had gotten to yet that reveals something extraordinary. That's Nobel. So what is this thing that she and her team have done? They decided, the name of the program is VASCO. It stands for vanishing, appearing, whatever the hell. But you can look it up. It's easy. VASCO, look up her name or look up the Nordic Institute of Astrophysics. They decided, let's look at all the astrophotography of the sky prior to Sputnik and maybe a couple of years after Sputnik, the first satellite, and see what we see. They looked at thousands of these plates, which are carefully archived and dated, and so forth. And what they discovered is prior to us putting up a satellite for the first time, there were things up there that were there, and then they weren't, and then they were back, and they reflected. Could be a star, but they didn't really look like stars. So what were they? Well, they weren't ours. And if they weren't somehow some very interesting natural phenomena, they were a construct of someone else. It was almost a slam dunk confirmation of an extraterrestrial reality. Now, it's possible a still shot of that particular spot in space caught an asteroid, some small asteroid happened to be going by, caught it, boom. And then when you photographed it, maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, it was gone. Could be, except that they found so many of these instances. The odds of catching an asteroid just happening to pass that part of the sky were extremely low. And then I think you had situations, if I'm not mistaken, where it was up on Monday, and then on Thursday it was still up, and then the next day it was gone. Has to be artificial, can't be human. They just elegantly confirm the extraterrestrial presence. Now, it's had 2 peer reviews, it's going to get more, and it's going to hold up. Now, that's brilliant science, but it gets better because all of those astroplates were time-stamped. And so they were able to compare the moment that that particular thing, which is artificial, with what was going on in the ground down below on the Earth. And what they came up with is a 45% correlation with the testing of nuclear weapons. Now, what we've been learning recently It came out in the film. It came out again in Farah's interview with Rogan. Is that, and we've known it for some time, but it's getting much more known, is that there is an enormous, huge connection between the extraterrestrial agenda and our nuclear programs, our weapons, our ICBMs, the testing, going all the way back to 45. And there's a logical reason for that. It's not hard to imagine why. She just found a connection back in the 1950s. So I'm saying that is a Nobel Prize winning project. She will be part of the State of the World Forum and many others like that. So I hope you all consider it. Look it up. If you want to register, get in touch with me by text or email. I'll provide you a PRG code that will save quite a bit of money. I can do that because I'm working with them and a sponsor.
Steve Bassett, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. Full personal disclosure reveal. It was great yakking with you. Thank you.
I'm a good yacker, Stan, and I've never been accused of not being able to yak, let me tell you. And I do it so much that I'm starting to lose my voice, and I've still got another like 15 interviews to do. But I appreciate your work. You've been part of this, what I call the podcast army, the interview army, which has emerged to this new tech, which has really made it tougher on the truth embargo till I continue to play hide and seek. So congratulations for your work, and let's do another interview one day.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallon of Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.